Bom, boa tarde. Quanta gente bonita a gente tem aqui hoje nesse teatro. É, Bom, hoje eu tenho o prazer de anunciar que nós teremos nossa segunda aula pública com a nossa querida Patrícia Hill Collins. Eu gostaria de fazer só alguns avisozinhos antes de fazer as apresentações. É o seguinte, tem uma lista de presenças rodando por aqui. Eu queria pedir que vocês assinassem, porque nós precisamos dessa lista para emitir os certificados de quem fez a inscrição e também para prestar conta do aluguel dos fones para a tradução simultânea. Então, eu gostaria de pedir a colaboração de vocês para que todo mundo assine essa lista que está rodando pelo teatro. Uma outra coisa é o seguinte, a gente precisa da paciência, da generosidade de todos aqui, porque a nossa querida Patrícia não passou muito bem essa semana, ela está tossindo muito, com dificuldades para falar, então a gente vai ter que limitar hoje o tempo do nosso evento e o número de perguntas que serão feitas. Eu já peço de antemão a paciência e a colaboração de todos vocês. Bom, dito isso, eu vou passar, então, às apresentações. Eu hoje estou ladeada por duas mulheres incríveis nessa mesa. Nós temos aqui a Patrícia, que, além de professora emérita da Universidade de Maryland, de ser uma das mais influentes pesquisadoras do feminismo negro nos Estados Unidos, ela é também musa e virou musa aqui, nossa, e virou também a fonte de uma letra de samba que o nosso querido Mumu, que é nosso aluno aqui, um grande artista, fez para ela. Eu vou ler a letra, não me arrisco a cantar, não sei se o Mumu está por aqui, se depois ele quiser dar uma canjinha, a gente até aceita. Ele diz o seguinte: é o feminismo negro, do qual eu faço parte, por ser negro, por ser feminista e também por ser da arte. Patrícia Hill Collins, referência para a nossa comunidade. Gratidão por suas aulas nesta universidade. Onde o bicho pega a toda hora, e se o filho chora, a mãe não pode ver. Gênero, raça, intersecções, precisamos debater. É o feminismo negro, do qual eu faço parte, por ser negro, por ser feminista e também por ser da arte. Muda-se a estratégia, mas da luta mantém-se a essência. Combater dominação, desumanização e violência. O sistema, assim como a casca do ovo, tem as suas rachaduras, ocupar lugar de poder e abalar as estruturas. É o feminismo negro, do qual eu faço parte, por ser negro, por ser feminista e também por ser da arte. Por ter esperança e luta por justiça social, é com amor, cuidado e carinho. É a coisa mais radical, é amar a mulher preta em sua plenitude. Desejo às pessoas presentes muita paz, amor e saúde. E nós temos também aqui a nossa queridíssima Matilde Ribeiro. Matilde Ribeiro, que é... Uhul! Ela que é professora da Unilab, né, da Universidade da Integração Internacional da Lusofonia Afro-Brasileira, e doutora honoris causa pela Universidade Federal do ABC. Matilde também foi ministra da Secretaria de Políticas de Promoção para a Igualdade Racial, CEPI, de 2003 a 2008. Ela é militante feminista e da luta antirracista. Matilde atua nos movimentos sociais desde a década de 1980, integrando diversos grupos e organizações, prestando consultoria e contribuindo na elaboração de demandas a serem apresentadas ao poder público, visando a promoção da equidade de gênero e raça no país. Então, Matilde hoje será a nossa debatedora. Assim que a Patrícia Hill Collins terminar a sua aula, Matilde vai fazer algumas considerações e abrir o debate. Bom, sem mais delongas, eu deixo a palavra com a nossa aguardadíssima, queridíssima Patrícia Hill Collins.
Boa noite. Não? Boa tarde. Não sei. I'm going to stand over here so I can see my PowerPoint, which is very big. I want to start off by telling you a little bit about the origins of this particular talk. This talk is about community. Community is not in the title, but the idea of community runs through this entire talk. As a sociologist, I was very bothered by how the term community is dealt with within the social sciences. It's often seen as a place of backwardness, or a place of Black people, or a place of women, or a place of touchy-feely things. It's not often seen as a political space. And what I want to do is reclaim the power of the term community so that it can be used and is used in political struggles. My topic today is intersectionality and political solidarity. I'm going to argue that intersectionality is a very good way to think about building different kinds of communities. And I will juxtapose, compare what I consider a participatory democracy, a community that wants to include all, to ideas of community that are very exclusive. Us, them thinking. Those of you who are astute may realize that I'm juxtaposing participatory democracy to far-right authoritarianism. And rather than taking them on directly, I want to look at what underpins this thinking. So I'm interested in political solidarity. I'm at the point now where I have written pretty much all I'm going to write about intersectionality. And I want to know how we can extend it in additional directions. So that's the spirit of this talk. I'm supposed to do that to change the slide. And it changed. All right. No. I want to remind you that today's talk is one of 4 talks that I'll be giving here at the university. And today's talk is focusing on intersectionalidade, which has 2 covers here in Brazil. And I'll be commenting on that in a minute. We've thus far had 1 talk on why Black feminism, and I will build on that talk today for the topic intersectionality and political solidarity. Next week, I'll move on to looking inside intersectionality. But this week, I'm looking to how intersectionality can be applied to politics, right? What are the political implications of this term? So an overview. An overview of today's talk. In part 1, I'm going to talk about intersectionality and political communities. I want to reclaim this term community from the notion that it's everything inside the community is wonderful, and if we could just get in our communities, everything would be solved. I consider the term community to be one of the most important political constructs out there, but it's taken for granted. Next, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to talk about competing views of political solidarity. My thoughts are, as you scale up from communities in the small scale to communities on the national level, you end up in a different place around political solidarity. People are imagining the nation differently. Let's keep that in mind. And finally, I'm going to look at two different strategies for using community politically, and this is what people actually do. These two strategies are often presented as competing, when I see them as complementary. And they are community organizing and coalition politics. They are not the same thing. Many of you may be involved in one versus the other, but to me, they really speak to each other. I will also be sharing, as long as my voice lasts, everybody, okay? As long as, when it gets like this, we may have to stop, all right? And I will whisper to someone. I'll pick someone from the front here. You can just come up here, and I will whisper in your ear, and you can say this for me, all right? Hopefully, it won't get to that point. Intersectionality and political communities. Oh, do some of us here recognize themselves in there? Oh, yes, all right. Last Friday, I met with a group of students who weren't just a group, they were a political community. And it really got me thinking about the layers of it all. So communities are the foundation of political action, but what kind of community? Before, though, I just want to say quickly, what is intersectionality? Because I can't assume that everybody knows what this is. Just two big ideas. There are many more than this, but just two. Intersectionality is all about power. Can we all say power? Poder, is that how I say power? Can we say poder? Poder. Poder! Thank you. I'm sorry, whoever's up there in the booth, they probably just had a fit. Because intersectionality is not just about individual identity. It is not about what's in you. I'm so intersectional. I'm Black and I'm female. That's part of it. But it's really about systems of power that intersect race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, nation, and age, among others. Intersectionality examines how these intersecting power relations are organized, endure, change, and are resisted. Intersectionality is not just a description of oppression. It also is a playbook for resisting oppression. The term relationality is crucial. It's a key concept in intersectionality, and I will return to that next week. But community really attaches to this term relationality. And what intersectionality aims to do, it aims to reform, challenge, and resist unjust social relations. It is a discourse of social justice. Now, a lot of people do intersectional scholarship now, and they're just describing poverty and oppression and racism, but they're not trying to think about how their work will make the world more socially just. So in many ways, we get wonderful work that leaves me depressed because it shows me how much I'm up against. It aims to reform, challenge, and resist unjust social relations. Now, how many of you think social relations in Brazil are fair? Put your hands up. Nobody? Not one person? Are you scared? How many of you see social injustice in Brazil? You can put your hands up. Oh, now we don't have to do the peer pressure here. All right, it's like, oh. Many people in the United States, I'll talk about my home country, see the United States as fair. They think that all Black people have an opportunity to achieve. They think women can rise as high as they want. They think LGBTQ people are just whining away about something that they just chose on their own. They do not see social injustice. It is invisible to them for a variety of reasons. I take the opposite view. Social justice is foundational to my work, and it is foundational to intersectionality. Intersectionality challenges something called naturalized hierarchy within communities. Now, let me just give you a little story, and this might make sense. Lots of times people think that if you're working against oppression of some kind, that everybody's doing that in solidarity. We all agree. But what tends to happen within political communities is the same thing that happens out in the world. Some people have more power than others and can't see it clearly. So here's my story. Would you like to hear my story from when I was a student? Way back in the day, way back machine. I gotta sit down, it's so long ago. Let me sit down for a minute. Long ago, my children. This was when I was a graduate student at Harvard University. And basically, the Black students at Harvard University, undergraduate and graduate students, were very disturbed by the fact that the Black people who worked for Harvard University made less money than the white people who worked for Harvard University, even though they were doing the same jobs. And that came about because the plumbers, people who fixed the pipes at Harvard, were in a union, and the plumbers' helpers were not in the union. So basically it was, we're fair. We're paying the plumbers what they're worth, and the Black people and the plumbers not in the union, why should we pay them union wages? What they neglected to pay attention to was the union would not let Black people in the plumbers union. So this was a clear case of racial discrimination. Okay, do you have a sense of what that was? The unfairness? Yeah? Shall I wait? Okay, that's long enough. Well, I was in a meeting of Black students to talk about what to do about this. And I was sitting next to my friend Grace. I'll just mention her name. I've changed her name. And Grace was the daughter of a major civil rights leader. Grace had been in the civil rights struggle in the South. Grace knew things like when the police come after you, you want to drop to the ground and curl up like a ball so that they don't kick you in your stomach. She had battle-tested strategies when it came to political action. So we go in a meeting, and there's lots of Black men in the meeting. And they said, okay, what shall we do? What shall we do? They said, you know what, Grace, can you go in the kitchen and make us some soup? Because we like the soup that you make, sopa. Okay. And they said to me, do you think you could go on the radio and read the description that we write? We want you to get on the radio and talk for us. And I thought to myself, this doesn't make any sense. Why would you not have the leader of the organization be the person who has the most experience in what you're trying to do? In that particular situation, gender got in the way. The men really felt that they were entitled to lead, even though they knew far less than some of the women in the room. Not me, Grace. And I thought, there's something wrong here, and I'm going to remember this. So when we look to the politics internally within a community or within a political community, it's important to remember that that community isn't just made up from nowhere. It is reflecting the broader politics of the culture where it's located. So now, what does intersectionality have to do with this? Well, if we had had an intersectional analysis, it would have been more obvious that we want to promote the talent that's up to the task. This is what happens in countries. I can't speak to Brazil, but I could make a very good guess. There is an assumption that some categories of people are simply better, and we want to promote them first, and others are less capable, so they need to stay on the bottom. So we did not have an intersectional analysis. We could not think about race and gender at the same time, but now we can, and we've come a long way. All right, so let me move on, or we'll be here all night. What I'm arguing here is that very often the way people think about community is a version of naturalized hierarchy. That it's natural within families. Who is the head of the family? Papa, daddy, whatever, okay? We tend to think about families very often as having a hierarchical structure, especially if we have grown up in families that have that hierarchical structure. It becomes naturalized to us for men to lead and women to follow. It becomes naturalized to us for white people to lead and Black people to follow. It becomes naturalized that people who are wealthy get to make decisions for everyone else. But what I'm arguing here is that families are sites where we learn social inequality. And community, social inequalities of gender, sexualities, age, and ethnicity. You think I'm going to get through this? I don't know. Okay, I'm going to say this anyhow, even though it's a big idea. So what tends to happen is people build communities on the basis of how they imagine families to be. So if you think about your own family, if it was equality all the way through, fine. But sometimes one person may not know what's best for another person. And you might need another structure in that family to get all that working. This is the foundation for community. Community is seen as family writ large, or communities are big families. So this family language, which often is unquestioned, becomes foundational to how we think about community and has the potential to shape political communities. How are you doing with this? Is this making sense? Yeah, I don't know how to think about this. All right, because okay, let's move on, and quickly. Intersectionality also challenges naturalized hierarchy among communities. We're used to thinking that some people's communities are better than others. And given enough time, we naturalize that as well. We don't see that as socially constructed or political. We just assume that's the way it is. My family, my community is better than your family and your community. So I'm really trying to get to this whole notion of ranked families and communities. And what comes out of this type of thinking is a ranking within society. This is how we get social inequality in a society, such that one group is at the top, another's at the middle, another's at the bottom. And we learn to see that as natural. So for example, when I land in the airport, what's up? Yes. Is this better? Oh, why didn't you say something? You're so polite. Don't be polite. You're probably not polite normally, right? You just came in here being all, I'm polite tonight. It's probably what that is. But anyhow, what I'm going to argue here is that this view of community scales up to national politics. So what I'm trying to do now is just give you a very brief introduction to how we need to make the term community more powerful politically, because it has implications on the national scale. There's a wonderful book called Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, I believe, that says this is how we imagine our nation state. This is how you imagine Brazil. This is how I imagine the United States. This is how people imagine South Africa or France. We are imagining our nation as a big community, but it matters what kind of community we have in mind when we're doing that imagining. Let me move on. What makes a community? Well, first of all, the people have to look fabulous, all right? This is a fabulous looking group of people, all right? Especially that one in the middle. You see that one right up in the middle? Her, okay. But what you're looking at is a community that is 10 years old, to my knowledge, and that has brought together people from all different kinds of backgrounds to this campus to say, we are a political community, and we are working hard not to have hierarchy, and we are working hard to claim our African ancestry as part of our community building project. So rather than giving community away to the far right, take it back and develop an analysis that works. Nope, too much. We'll just go with some key points. So some key points, just to sum up what I've said thus far. If I haven't said it thus far, I should have said it thus far. Political communities are the bedrock of multiple systems of inequality. In other words, race, gender, and nation draw upon ideas of community and naturalized hierarchy. This is how the stuff gets constructed. This is very different than saying inequality is socially constructed and that's the end of the discussion. What I am doing is taking you through the points of how this actually works to open up some space for doing things differently. Ideas and practices concerning gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and class bind communities together. Often you see an us versus them thinking with social inequality. Social hierarchies operate both within and among communities. And finally, nation and nationalism. These ideas about communities scale up to national politics. They underpin changing contours of global capitalism, colonialism, racism, and heteropatriarchy. Okay, let me pause here for a minute and see how you're doing. How are you all doing? You're doing okay? Okay. Who is completely mystified about what I've said thus far? Put your hands up. Like, I don't know what that lady is talking about. Okay, lie to me for a little bit, all right? Even if that was you, like, I don't know what she's talking about. Let me go a little further. Now let's get into some examples that might help. Competing views of political solidarity. I'm going to argue that political solidarity rests on understandings of community, and that these views are competing views. This is the case of authoritarianism and participatory democracy, the case of the United States. And I will describe each of these graphics in this next part of the presentation. Here are the competing views of US national identity. We the people. Every American citizen who has a passport has in that passport the American eagle, the flag, and words that say, we the people of the United States in order to make a more perfect union, etc. And everybody wants to think that, well, they got it right from the beginning. But when you go back to the US from the very beginning, you have the twin situation of the beauty of the vision of democracy and the reality of slavery, which is in the Constitution. Okay. They had to compromise in order to start the country. So on one side, we have authoritarianism. Now, I'll just use our examples of authoritarianism. Feel free to fill in your own examples if you can come up with some, but I'm not going to bother with yours. I'm a guest here. But in the United States, authoritarianism, first, let me just back up. Have you heard of this guy called Donald Trump? Have you heard of Donald Trump? Do you have a sense of what Donald Trump did or didn't do? Okay. Have you heard of some of these other authoritarian leaders who follow the same playbook? And here it is. Political solidarity is based on the hierarchy of groups. If we want political solidarity, the people at the bottom have to just put up with being on the bottom because they're not on the top. Citizenship is hierarchical. You're not equal. Citizenship is hierarchical. First class, second class, and ambiguous citizenship. Everybody may have the same citizenship by law, but not everybody gets the same citizenship treatment. And in the US, race, wealth, and masculinity really get you better treatment than others. So we have first class, second class citizenship. The government need not represent the interests of all people. Why should the government take care of these lackards down at the bottom? Why should we send their kids to school? Why should we pay taxes for little black children to go to school? My gosh, they're never going to amount to anything. So we might as well just save our money. Now, that's an authoritarian, hierarchical way of thinking about citizenship. And finally, it's exclusionary national identity. This is national identity that is based on keeping others out, the bad people out, and the good people in. This whole way of thinking about communities and nations has gathered steam in the last 8 years, maybe even 10 at this point. Now, on the other side, we have participatory democracy. Political solidarity is based on equality of individuals. That's how we build solidarity. Citizenship reflects individual human rights. Each person is treated with integrity, no matter how poor they are or how rich they are. In the eyes of the law, they are equal. This is a view of equality that's quite different than authoritarian stuff. Representative government is supposed to ensure fairness. Well, we have a terrible time in the US right now with representative government not working as well as it should. It's supposed to ensure fairness. And basically, inclusionary national identity as an aspirational goal. You want to bring people in to the national community. You want to promote them from within the national community. You want the best talent that you have to rise to the top. Authoritarianism assumes that it already is the best talent, and it pushes people to the bottom. Political solidarity and authoritarianism. This graphic over here is from a 2017 rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where young white men marched through this college town carrying the Confederate flag and the Nazi flag. They had put together two versions of white supremacy and taken it to this particular college town. And they were angry, and they got a lot of media attention, because this is when it became apparent to many people that authoritarianism in the United States was a bona fide political threat. It was not a fad. It was coming, and it was coming fast. Some of you may be familiar with these authoritarian ideologies. They share a lot of similarities. Ultranationalism, white supremacy, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, fascism, all of them are designed to keep some people, us, in the community and keep other people, them, outside of the community. There's a requirement for ideological conformity. Authoritarianism says, choose an ideology and adhere to its beliefs. Toe the line. Now, it may come as a surprise to many of you that the ideology can be very leftist. So it's not that the ideology is going to necessarily be white supremacist or heteropatriarchal. It may be that you find some very politically active people on the left who are basically building political communities that are authoritarian. And this is why I just can't do a simple us-them kind of thing here. But keep that in mind. Equality is through sameness. So if you're in a community like this or in a nation like this, your job is to fit in. It's to be the same as everybody else. And that usually means the people at the top. And if you can't, do that sameness, you got problems. Solidarity requires obedience, submission, and uniformity. When people say sit down and shut up, they're asking people to submit and toe the line. Top-down power relations with a leader at the top and fixed hierarchy within the group. Authoritarian thinking often rests on the supreme leader, whoever that may be. The person who's at the top, who everyone idolizes. Now, I'm going to get into some hot water here, because I'm just going to say it anyhow. Here, some religious philosophies do the same thing. They are actually authoritarian. They are not democratic. And they're doing these exact same strategies of there's someone at the top who is the leader who must be obeyed all the time, and there is fixed hierarchy within a group. So, for example, women will always be on the bottom. They will never be leaders. It's kind of like my group at grad school. And this approach sees other groups through an us-them framework. And this is exactly what happened at this rally. Because as these young men marched through this college town, they yelled, "You will not replace us." I don't know if you've heard the great replacement theory. This is an idea within white supremacist ideology that all these people of color, all these beautiful brown people, all of these black people, all of these Asian people, all of these Jews, all these people who are not white and male like us are somehow poisoning the body politic. We, us, must protect ourselves from them. So, just to build on this a little bit, the defense of naturalized hierarchies is protecting communities. A good degree of the immigration policy in the US now is ringing the bell of authoritarian thinking. It's saying, we can't let these people in. These people will ruin the country. Now, the irony, of course, is that the United States, with the exception of indigenous and black people, is a nation of immigrants. But somehow, people have forgotten that their own relatives came in the same way. So there is a fight to protect the boundaries of the community or the national borders from the enemy within. We're back to family now. Gender and sexuality. If the women don't do what they're supposed to do, what shall we do? If my son turns out to be gay, what shall we do? If my daughter is trans and she's no longer my daughter, what shall we do? That is the enemy within, so we must police that rigorously. But there's also the enemy outside, because inside is pure, outside is not. Outside are the masses. Outside is where you find race. Outside is where all ethnicity comes into it, and religion. So the question is, how are social inequalities being reworked in relation to community? What kind of work is the term community doing to uphold authoritarian projects? Everybody hear that? It's taking that term and asking, what kind of work is it doing? Now, if I look at authoritarianism in public policies, here's what shows up all the time. It's visibly concerned with safety and security. America is now armed with guns. We're awash with guns. All these people have gone out and bought guns because they are fearing for their lives, because they have been told to be afraid of all the people who are not like them. The us-them thinking has actually turned some people crazy who weren't crazy before. So, safety within the community. You know you're safe if it's just people like you. You get an enclave in your basically rich white community and don't let anybody in unless they have been vetted. And that is safe. But that's eroding because the guns have gotten out of control. Safety from others outside the community. And this is the unwillingness to see others in any terms other than outsiders. Them. We don't want to go to school with them. We don't want to work with them. We don't want our children being educated with them. So you get a society, authoritarian society, that is obsessed with policing borders, borders of sexuality, borders of gender, borders of race, borders of citizenship status, borders of religion. Because social change threatens the naturalized hierarchy of this whole situation. Now notice, can I be really candid here? You know I'm not talking about Brazil, right? Wink, wink. I'm talking about the United States. But there are many countries that are following this playbook. Now, political solidarity and participatory democracy. This is the alternative. And it is the alternative that often does not get the visibility that it should, but it's there nonetheless. What you're seeing here on the side is a graphic. This is from, the year has escaped me, March for Our Lives. And this is a march that was put together by high school students who managed to get 80,000 people to show up in Washington, D.C. 1 month after a school shooting at their school, where many of their classmates were killed. And this picture is taken from the podium of the march that day in Washington, D.C. And what these young people are saying is, we believe in participatory democracy, not just for the kids in our school, but for the whole country. We are the face of the country. We are the youth of the country. We will not be silenced because we're walking, marching for our lives. Now, this is really important because the ideas that I have on the left, fundamentally, these kids who are like 16, 17, this one up here in the front, she's 11, if you can believe it. I don't know how they did it. Equality through respect for differences. They don't seem to have a problem with respecting differences when you're pulling together a coalition of people against gun violence. Citizen participation strengthens the political community. Authoritarian folk don't want citizen participation unless it's citizens just like them. So they do everything they can to massage the rules so other people cannot participate. We are now going through a scandalous period of losing the vote through rules and regulations, not through somebody coming in and saying, you can't have it anymore. Cultivating talent, this is where I started early on. Cultivating talent through recognition of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. This is the talent of the country. Does it make sense to only educate 2 of those people and give them an opportunity and say the rest, go home? Or does it make sense to cultivate the talent of people who are there, who may not meet the profile of what a talented teacher or professor or minister or whatever prestigious corporate executive, maybe they don't meet that profile, but they're all there in the youth, every single one of them in the kids. So when I look at this picture, I was quite stunned because they managed to do in 1 month what adults were not able to do in years. And they basically said, we're not taking this anymore. And when we get old enough to vote, you better believe we're going to remember this. The Black Lives Matter movement is an example of this kind of citizen participation. It's ironic because many people think that the Black Lives Matter movement are radicals. Well, they might be radical, but not the way they mean it. The Black Lives Matter movement is against democracy. But I see the Black Lives Matter movement as essential to participatory democracy because these are the people who decided they were going to show up and try and make things different. This is a parallel to March for Our Lives. And if you look at my first talk last week, I believe I talked about violence, dehumanization, and domination. And this is what underlies the Black Lives Matter movement. Black women are prominently featured in this movement, having started the hashtag. There's our young woman who's confronting the police. And there's the book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. That's an older woman who's lived her whole life with this, who says, hands up, don't shoot. And the book, Making All Black Lives Matter by Barbara Ransby, which is a very good book. So the Black Lives Matter movement is actually a movement, I would argue, full of patriots. This is not a movement that's given up on America at all. People are angry, definitely. You would be angry if people killed your kids. You would be angry if they dehumanized your kids and treated them lesser. You would be angry if you were dominated from one generation to the next. These are reasonable reasons to be angry. But that doesn't make you someone that's going to tear down the country. So what we have here, and I think I'll come back to this later, are competing views of political solidarity. And I've taken you through quite an amount of material tonight, so I appreciate your being patient and hanging in there, right? Because I think these ideas are very important for us to understand the kinds of systems where we live. We can't just depend on thumbs up, I like it, thumbs down, I don't like it. We have to do the analysis that gets us where we want to go. Okay. And what's going to happen now is, I'm just going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to stop because I don't think I can continue. My little voice is like, ah! And if we have any time, and I can fold in part 3 in next week's lecture. I don't have to do it tonight. All right. So for those of you who are enthralled with the whole notion of how we can reclaim community as a political construct, I have some cool slides though, but I'll bring them next week. Okay. So I'd like to just stop here and see where this leaves you. If we could open the floor up for a few questions, that would be good while I sit down. Thank you.
Eu agora, então, passo a palavra a Matilde Ribeiro, que vai fazer alguns comentários. Acho que só um minutinho até ela...
Bom, pessoal, boa noite.
Alô? Agora funciona.
Bom, agora vai? Vai. Eu estava agradecendo, dizendo que eu ainda não conhecia este local aqui, embora há muito, muito tempo atrás, né, Patrícia? Há muito, muito tempo atrás, eu tenha participado aqui na Zona Leste, né, muito pertinho. Eu trabalhei muito tempo entre São Miguel, Guaianazes, Itaquera, e eu tenho acompanhado a movimentação, a luta por uma universidade na região ou perto, né? Isso remonta aí ao final dos anos 80, anos 90, em que eu trabalhava numa organização chamada SOF, Sempre Viva, hoje Sempre Viva Organização Feminista, naquela época, Serviço de Orientação à Família. E nós trabalhávamos com os movimentos sociais, nessa região, São Miguel, Guaianazes e Itaquera, sobretudo com o movimento de saúde, e fazendo cruzamentos também com o movimento de educação. Então, este lugar foi almejado por muitas pessoas e lugares por onde passei, né? E é bem interessante estar aqui, Melvina, muito bacana. Quero dizer do meu prazer em lhe conhecer, Patrícia. Você já é minha amiga de muitos anos, embora não me conheça. Eu sou uma das leitoras suas, e aqui no Brasil eu tenho uma militância com o movimento feminista, movimento negro, e você falou aqui de interseccionalidade. Esta pode ser uma palavra nova nos meios acadêmicos, né? Mas essa prática, né, de trabalhar de maneira conjunta gênero, raça, classe, não só nos Estados Unidos, mas também no Brasil e em tantos outros países, ela vem crescendo, né, de décadas para cá, né? Então, do que eu ouvi aqui, somando com algumas reflexões, tem algumas coisas que ficam assim pipocando, né, nas nossas mentes ao longo da nossa vida. Então, eu vou procurar aqui, de maneira breve, fazer algum cruzamento entre o que eu ouvi e o que fica pipocando na mente, né? Não é nada difícil quando ouvimos a Patrícia em situações que aparecem reflexões críticas sobre a realidade norte-americana, a gente meio que se vê num espelho, né? Embora as diferenças do ponto de vista do poder, questões econômicas, existem muitas diferenças entre Brasil e Estados Unidos, mas tem muitas semelhanças também no modus operandi, né? Considerando que nós vivemos numa região capitalista, né? Então, dá para identificar muitas coisas em comum, sobretudo na explicação sobre as desigualdades e as iniquidades, assim também como nas explicações sobre as formas de reversão desta situação. E aí eu vou situar duas coisas, para não me prolongar muito. Quando a Patrícia fala de solidariedade, solidariedade política, democracia participativa, eu entendo que é uma busca não tão jovem, né, uma busca já antiga, do Brasil e também de países da América Latina e Caribe, de quebrar os autoritarismos das ditaduras, né, e construir pegadas, construir caminhos para realidades mais democráticas e mais solidárias. A questão que eu coloco neste ponto é que, embora haja uma grande movimentação progressista, uma grande movimentação à esquerda, principalmente aqui no Brasil, nos últimos anos, nós levamos um choque, né? Porque nós acordamos numa realidade, deitamos numa realidade e acordamos noutra recentemente, onde a extrema-direita quis tomar conta da nossa vida, né? E a voz da democracia, a voz da solidariedade e da justiça ficou rouca nesse período, né? Então, tem aí esse baque que nós vivemos, mas tem também uma construção histórica que é uma queixa, e não é uma queixa porque esses movimentos são reclamões, mas é uma queixa porque baseia-se em fatos históricos, leituras acadêmicas e política, de que, mesmo quando nós olhamos o Brasil pelo olhar progressista, pelo olhar de esquerda, as questões de gênero, raça e do campo da diversidade são colocadas em segundo plano. Dificilmente nós vivemos situações de instituições que são efetivamente democráticas, colocando essas questões de gênero, raça, a questão das comunidades LGBT num patamar de igualdade com outras questões sociais, e abre-se um abismo entre as questões ditas gerais e as questões ditas específicas. Essa é uma realidade, infelizmente, ainda presente, muito presente no Brasil, mas com lutas para a reversão disso, né? E quando você fala sobre reação e resistência, eu entendo que esta perspectiva de reação e resistência, pelo olhar da interseccionalidade, ela carrega elementos muito interessantes que têm a ver, também avalio com o que você colocou, de criação de comunidades, né? Então, venho acompanhando há anos o movimento feminista, o movimento negro no Brasil, e quero exemplificar essa busca por dentro desses dois movimentos pela ação das mulheres negras brasileiras, né? Eu acabei de presentear a Patrícia com um livro que eu escrevi recente, cujo título é Mulheres Negras em Movimento. O seu está comigo, tá? Não aqui, mas eu lhe dou depois. Mulheres Negras em Movimento. E, neste livro, eu trago um pouco dessa reflexão sobre interseccionalidade, sobre esta dificuldade histórica de que as questões de gênero e raça e feminismo cheguem junto com as questões sociais, né? E o que eu quero destacar neste ponto é o seguinte: as mulheres negras no Brasil, eu sou produto disso. Lá no final dos anos 80, estava lá nessa situação ao vivo Lélia Gonzalez, Benedita da Silva, Sueli Carneiro, Zélia Amador de Deus, enfim, um bando de mulheres que são evidências no nosso país. Eu estava chegando magrinha, pequena, né? Estava engatinhando. Isso há 30 anos atrás. Foi organizado aqui o primeiro Encontro Nacional de Mulheres Negras, e aconteceu em 1988. Neste ano, muitas coisas aconteceram, né? 1988 foi o ano da revisão constitucional, que gerou uma Constituição que é compreendida como uma Constituição cidadã, embora muito ainda tenha que ser aplicado, né? E também foi o ano em que completou 100 anos da abolição da escravidão no Brasil. E o governo da época, vocês devem ter ouvido falar, José Sarney, queria fazer uma grande comemoração dos 100 anos da abolição. E o movimento negro, os movimentos à esquerda, disseram: mas Comemorar o quê? Aboliu o quê? Né? Se a população negra ficou à deriva depois da abolição, que vai completar 135 anos este ano. Então, este encontro de mulheres negras, contextualizado por essas outras questões que eu apresentei, construiu um ideário que mudou, contribuiu para a mudança da cena brasileira em relação à presença das mulheres negras na vida política, a representatividade. A questão básica, a denúncia que esta organização de mulheres negras trazia naquele momento era sobre a invisibilidade política destas no movimento negro, no movimento feminista, nos movimentos sociais e na sociedade. Então, o posicionamento político das mulheres negras naquele tempo foi de atuar por dentro do movimento feminista, branco, de classe média, a leitura feita no Brasil, e atuar por dentro do movimento negro, o que resulta numa equação que vocês vão encontrar num texto da Sueli Carneiro, que a Sueli diz o seguinte, que esta decisão das mulheres negras de se construírem de maneira mais empoderada chegou à condição de que enegreceu o movimento feminista e feminilizou o movimento negro. Então, poderia dizer, gol, né? Tudo certo em relação a essa decisão política tomada pelas mulheres negras. Mas isso resolveu a nossa vida enquanto cidadã? Não, claro que não, né? A luta está aí presente e contínua. E aí entra, vou finalizar com isso, entra no campo das políticas públicas, né? Um marco que nós tivemos aqui no Brasil foi em 1995, quando foi realizada a Marcha Zumbi dos Palmares pela cidadania e pela vida. Essa marcha foi uma concentração de instituições e pessoas em Brasília, e desta marcha, entregue para o presidente da época, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, foi entregue um documento propositivo, chamado Documento para a Superação do Racismo no Brasil. Acabou o racismo? Não, longe de acabar, mas construiu, a partir daquele momento, uma outra forma de negociação e diálogo entre o movimento social e governo para a construção das políticas públicas. E os que depois veio a Conferência de Durban, né, em 2001, e os que defendiam as políticas públicas de caráter racial, né, as ações afirmativas, depois foi afunilando para as cotas nas universidades, os que defendiam eram muitas vezes taxados de radicais, taxados de que estavam copiando o modelo norte-americano, advindo dos anos 60, da guerra civil, da ação civil, de onde surgem os personagens norte-americanos que nós conhecemos aqui, como Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks e assim por diante. Então, nós éramos taxados de copiadores desta realidade. Mais uma vez, gol, nós estávamos certos quando defendíamos as políticas de cotas. Olha aí, como muda a cara da universidade, né? Antigamente, nós entrávamos na universidade e parecia Dinamarca, né? Parecia Dinamarca. Hoje não, né? Hoje tem cara de Osasco, tem cara de Guarulhos, tem cara de São Miguel, né? Tem cara de gente E eu finalizo, então, falando. Alô. Então, finalizo com um outro exemplo, que só vou jogar aqui, depois a gente via a nosso intercâmbio aí com o Melvina, a gente pode continuar conversando. Mas, no dia 27 de abril deste ano, eu, pela Unilab, que é onde eu dou aula na área de pedagogia, e o professor Acácio, que está por aí, né, é da área de Relações Internacionais na UFABC, eu simplesmente fiz uma pergunta ao Acácio. Eu estava com esse negócio das empregadas domésticas na cabeça. Eu perguntei, Acácio, o que sua mãe fazia? Qual era o trabalho da sua mãe? Empregada doméstica. A minha também. E da maioria das pessoas aqui, mais velhas e pobres. Né? Bom, o que nós fizemos para começar a conversa? Nós fizemos uma live, que estávamos eu e o Acácio como depoentes, filhos que se tornaram doutores, uma especialista no campo, a Luciana Dias, que é da Universidade de Goiás, e 2 empregadas domésticas sindicalistas. E abrimos um diálogo, dando continuidade ao que eu já tinha vivenciado quando ministra, em apoio à FENATRAD, Federação Nacional de Trabalhadoras Domésticas. Né? Naquele momento, lá atrás, no início dos anos 2000, nós montamos um projeto chamado Trabalho Doméstico Cidadão, os eixos eram elevação de escolaridade, melhoria da condição de trabalho e habitação popular. Esse projeto andou e a presidenta Dilma lançou, em 2015, um pacote de direitos baseado na PEC, né, numa peça no parlamento, uma peça política, e essa PEC encaminhando possibilidades de direitos para as empregadas domésticas, equiparando aos demais trabalhadores. E eu quero só dizer isso, que essa PEC, feita pela presidenta Dilma, trouxe um debate político que você citou aí na sua fala, que, em vários momentos, os entraves, né, eles impedem das coisas andarem. A classe média reagiu, dizendo que o pacote de direitos que equipara as trabalhadoras domésticas ao conjunto de trabalhadores era inconstitucional, era um assinte, a classe média não poderia pagar sua parte. Né? Então, trabalho doméstico no Brasil ainda está muito associado à escravidão, e a maioria são mulheres negras, e a maioria jovem trabalhadora doméstica, pena para conseguir trabalhar e estudar. Então, essa é uma realidade que nós desvendamos de novo publicamente com essa live, e está na nossa pauta de trabalho das universidades. Nós queremos trabalhar isso por dentro da universidade. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, Matilde. Então, eu passo a palavra para a Patrícia. Enquanto a Patrícia fala, eu pediria que as pessoas que quiserem fazer perguntas, mas nós só faremos 5 perguntas, venham até aqui. Os primeiros 5 que chegarem fazem, e hoje é só isso.
While they're coming? Okay. You know, while people are coming up to ask the questions, one thing that you said, the whole notion of general issues and particular issues, that there are general social issues, and then there are issues of race and class and gender are particular issues. I see both of them as being the same thing, because race and class and gender and sexuality all involve power, and that very much shapes social issues. In fact, I meant to mention this in my talk, but the term intersectionality was not used until the 1990s, well after the social movements of the last century were underway and wrapping up. And what came out of those social movements were women of color, Black women, Latinos, Indigenous women, LGBTQ women, I think who I'm leaving out, who said, our situation with violence is a social problem for us. And we don't see how you're going to solve a problem of social violence in the country without solving the problem of social violence for us. So in many ways, we are a bellwether for what goes on in this country. Now, each of these groups had a different history in the United States. Indigenous people were dealing with the appropriation of land and genocide. Black people were dealing with the legacy of slavery and labor exploitation and intergenerational captivity. Immigrant groups like Asians were coming from far away to work and were not given access to citizenship. The Latino Chicano population was part of Mexico that was conquered, and the US took the land. And each of those bigger systems of power had violence attached to it, but different forms of violence. So what was happening was women of color were organizing in their own communities. This is what Black women were doing within Black communities when it was safe to do this. Indigenous women were organizing within their communities. Community was foundational to women's politics and to feminist politics. It was quite different than a feminist politics that's organized around the individual and individual rights. So what was happening was women of color were organizing in the context of their communities and criticizing those communities while organizing. But the moment of a broader social movement enabled them to see each other. So it was an interesting moment of violence being a unifying issue, or countering violence being a unifying issue. That was a way of moving beyond the different experiences that women had with violence. They had to learn how to respect each other's experiences and build a movement of equality using difference. We don't do a good job of doing that yet. We sort of assume that a social movement is people all just like us, and then the other people who are out, they have a totally different experience. But this early work on intersectionality was really radical, in that it offered not just a new analysis of power, but a new way of doing politics that tonight I'm arguing is really grounded in collective action, not just having a rally or a march, but grounded in theory that thinks about all this through the language of group-based power. So when you were saying, I said to myself, wait a minute, let me write this down. So that's what made me think when you talked about the general issues and the particular issues, because we're all still fighting that. When you bring up the issue of Black kids, everybody says that's a particular issue. Why can't we talk about all kids? This was a common pushback against the Black Lives Matter movement. Well, don't all lives matter? And the answer is they won't matter until all Black lives matter. So the whole notion of the both and thinking that's involved with this kind of political framework, this kind of political solidarity. What I was trying to do tonight is really say, we really can start our thinking about political solidarity in a different place. And there are plenty of people out there who are already doing this and have done this.
Você que é o primeiro.
Boa noite. Que responsa, eu aqui nesse lugar, né? Aqui. Aqui. Aqui? Tá ótimo. Primeiramente, gratidão. Gratidão demais pelos ensinamentos e pela oportunidade da gente estar aqui numa mesa tão rica. Patrícia, Malvina, Matilde, sem sombra de dúvida, é um presente para todos nós. Eu venho aqui falar um pouco a respeito do que acontece, né, nas relações que estão fora do âmbito acadêmico e estão fora do grande âmbito político, que são discussões de pequenas comunidades que acontecem em lugares que estão fora dessas grandes discussões, de pequenos grupos que tentam sobreviver, mas que também produzem uma série de conhecimentos e uma série de realidades, né? A gente tem aí a Carolina de Jesus como um grande expoente desse universo, e eu tomei a liberdade de trazer aqui, né? Não falaria por mim, mas as palavras de uma mulher preta periférica chamada Jennifer Nascimento, que é uma poeta que escreve literatura periférica na Zona Sul de São Paulo, e fala muito sobre a realidade da mulher preta que não teve condição de estar nesse lugar, mas que também conversa muito com todas as ideias que foram colocadas aqui. Minha grande pergunta é o seguinte: quando há um destaque em termos de liderança, em termos de uma conversa que seja interseccional, porque esses grupos, eles também se dividem por conta das questões que não são comuns, né? Eles mais se dividem por aquilo que não é comum do que se unem em relação àquilo que lhe é comum, e essa é a realidade que vem sendo trazida de forma distinta. Quando as pessoas que conseguem unir essas ideias, elas têm destaque nesses pequenos lugares e influenciam a sua comunidade, elas são alçadas a um outro espaço de discussão, que é o espaço institucional. Esse espaço institucional ainda é um espaço, infelizmente, branco, racista, machista, com todos os adjetivos aí que a gente pode colocar. E aí o que isso faz? Isso faz com que a produção dentro desses espaços ela fique prejudicada, porque o apoio ali dentro é pequeno, e cria um distanciamento também da base de onde essa pessoa saiu. Minha pergunta é como fazer com que essa voz ecoe dentro desse espaço institucional, sem deixar um vácuo no espaço de origem. E aí o livro fica aqui como presente para você levar uma literatura que é nossa daqui também.
You simply must travel. I mean, the notion of just staying in one place and doing all your politics in one place, if you have the option to go into the white institutional space and get whatever you can get from that space, that's one thing. But radical political change does not occur in the white institutional space. It really occurs in spaces that are, when I say quilombo spaces, spaces that are separate, spaces that are created for the, is it Carolina Maria de Jesus? Close? Did I say that correctly? That's actually the first book I read about Brazil years ago. And I remember reading this book and being incredibly impressed by someone who was that dedicated to knowledge and writing that she was going to write her own book on the scraps of paper. Now, when you have that kind of tradition, you don't have to go into white institutional space to convince anybody that you are worthy. You can stand on that foundation, find all the other people who are also in that foundation, and they may be in places that are unexpected. It's an organizational challenge to organize in a space that you can then go into the white institutional space or the male institutional space, and that's where you're going to get change. But you'll know who has your back if it's community organizing. So that's why I'm really using this term community, because I think they have taken the power away from a term that is very much valued by people on the bottom. The term community often means all we have is each other. That's it. You may not have anything else, but all we have is each other. And if you realize that is the existential reality that you are living with, that is a very different way of being grounded in the world than worrying about what people who have degrees say about you. You actually have to pay attention to that so you can get jobs and things like that. But that's very different than saying, this is a social justice struggle. And this is a social justice struggle that is all about the kinds of relationships we can build with other people who see it this way. And if they don't see it this way, we need to talk about that. The equality through difference, not here's equality and difference we add in later on when we have time. All right, that's what you get in the white institutional space. You get naturalized hierarchy in that space, and you waste a lot of time. So I learned early on I do not believe in people wasting my time. I know how to waste my own time quite well on my own, thank you very much. I don't need you to help me, right? So for me, going back and forth between community spaces, university spaces, and I've also been able to travel in spaces that are far beyond anything that I would have expected. But if you're not grounded in why you're doing something, it becomes very difficult to keep going. I think the things that people who are in the periphery, I think the issues that people who are in the periphery care about are universal issues. We just don't see them as universal issues because we don't see those people as universal humans. So it's impoverished thinking on our part about how we actually think about that. But I love this question. Thank you. Obrigada.
Boa noite. Estou muito nervosa, então vou tentar falar um pouco devagar. Meu nome é Catarina. Eu faço uma pesquisa sobre trabalho doméstico remunerado aqui no Brasil. Então, eu me comovi muito assim com a aula de hoje e tudo com que a Matilde falou também. Eu acho que as trabalhadoras domésticas são mulheres que você vê claramente essa questão interseccional no Brasil. E eu estudo especificamente a questão sindical do trabalho doméstico. Né? Então, eu faço trabalho de campo no Sindicato das Trabalhadoras Domésticas de Campinas, que foi o primeiro sindicato do Brasil, fundado pela Laudelina de Campos Melo. E essas mulheres, as sindicalistas, elas falam muito sobre essa questão da participação política, que foi um tema muito presente hoje, e como é importante ter essa consciência política para lutar pelos direitos. Só que, assim, uma coisa que elas batem muito na tecla é que essa conquista de direitos é muito complicada. A gente viu com a PEC, né, com a proposta de emenda constitucional, enfim. Só que, além de conquistar direitos ser muito difícil, é difícil também garantir que esses direitos sejam cumpridos. E, além das políticas públicas, que são muito importantes para o desempenho do trabalho doméstico, né? Por exemplo, além das coisas que a Matilde falou, acho que também é importante creches para essas mulheres ter onde colocarem os filhos delas, enfim. Uma coisa que elas falam também é essa dificuldade da fiscalização desses direitos. Como que isso pode acontecer, levando em conta que existem mais de 6 milhões de trabalhadoras domésticas no Brasil, e muitas estão em condições análogas à escravidão. Então, a gente fica meio que num limbo, assim, sem saber como que tornar esse trabalho visível, tornar esse trabalho que as pessoas elas valorizem esse trabalho, porque ele merece ser valorizado. Então, eu queria um pouco escutar de você sobre isso, se você tem alguma visão sobre isso, porque meio que parece que, não sei, assim, é algo tão estrutural da sociedade que não parece ter uma saída, assim, para essa questão dos direitos. E é isso.
This is really what I would talk about as naturalized hierarchy. The whole notion that this hierarchy is so normalized and so naturalized that you cannot see it as hierarchy anymore. People just see it as that's the way things are. I would be very surprised if Black domestic workers see it that way. I would be very surprised if they thought that this is all they wanted for their lives. I think these are real people who understand what the situation is in terms of wages, work, race, and gender. Certainly that was the case in the US at one point, where that was the only work you could get. I guess my answer here would be, I know what I want to say, and I'm trying to think about not saying it. I don't want it to sound like trite. You know, I don't want an answer like, oh, just do this, do that, because I think it's hard. I think we really need a rethinking of, I'd go back in those communities and I would get those domestic workers to sit down and just have some tea or some coffee and talk about their experiences. Because what happens when people do that, whether it's in family situations or community situations, is they realize that what they are experiencing is not isolated, but is in fact communal. And they may already realize that, but not necessarily know what their rights are or what strategies other people have used to grapple with this same situation. This is where educated people might be helpful, as long as they don't get in the way and want to talk down to people. But the question of, in fact, the 2 slides I didn't do, one of them is the community organizing slide, which talks about women who everybody would look at as seeing at the bottom and they cannot help themselves, but they organized if given the opportunity. And I'm going to bring that in a future talk here. So this is really kind of I wouldn't call it a scattered answer, but I'm just calling it, because I would have to give another 20-minute lecture somehow, and I know we all don't want that. So let's just avoid that. But the whole notion of organizing and knowing the people who you are working with, and knowing that there are many women who do not want their daughters to live the lives that they are living. And that often can be the point, the inflection point for organizing, and for organizing on behalf of their daughters and sons, so that they can avoid what these women do willingly, because they know it's important for the survival of their family. So I am going to end up back at education. The whole notion of all you can do is have a skill set that leads you to domestic work. That's all you're ever going to do. But if you have other options, like there are schools in your community or in your neighborhood, there is youth employment of some kind, there is Saturday and Sunday school. That is a way of saying, you don't have to do that. And if you don't do that, then others will say, well, maybe I don't have to do that either. So it's a long uphill struggle, but I like it. Like your question. Thank you.
Boa tarde. Eu fico muito emocionada por hoje estar aqui. Agradecer a presença de 2 mulheres negras que eu converso há muito tempo e não me conhecem, mas que eu admiro e tenho a oportunidade de ler. E falar um pouquinho de mim, né? Eu sou Rosa, eu acabei de fazer minha defesa de doutorado, agora em abril, e uma das... Obrigada. É duplamente emocionante, né? E uma questão que eu acho interessante, que eu gostaria de tensionar aqui no debate, é pensar nas meninas negras. Então, na minha pesquisa de doutorado, eu tenho conversado com escritoras negras de educação. Aliás, eu conversei com escritoras negras de educação, de literatura infantil, com professoras negras de educação infantil, para pensar um pouco no lugar da menina negra. Eu acho que tensionar assim, qual o lugar da menina negra, né, pensando dentro dessas hierarquias, né, a idade, como você bem coloca, é uma questão bem... nossa, é uma emoção. É uma questão bem pungente, mas, ao mesmo tempo, a invisibilidade desses sujeitos sociais. Obrigada. Meu doutorado aqui é da primeira turma da Unifesp de Educação.
Okay, are you finished yet? Because I think you have a lot to say. Okay. No, I think the issue with Black girls is Black girls are going to grow up to be not Black girls, Black women. So the question is, what do girls need to think about? And we often want to shield them so they still have a childhood before they get into other situations. But I have found the best thing to do is to be completely honest. And that would mean, since you're in education, developing a counter curriculum for Black girls that may not be in your school, but that may have another network that people could use. That might mean writing children's books for Black girls and Black boys who should be reading books about Black girls that open up the mind. Why should we always have to read through other people's literature to find our experiences? This is back to the universal particular again. Why can we not find the universal experience in the lives of Black girls? Now, Black girls are often adultified. They're seen as they're sexualized. They are seen as being little women and treated accordingly. And I think we have to be ever vigilant around the treatment of Black girls this way. There's a parallel discourse about Black boys, about how they're seen as threatening. So in a lot of ways, I see this as a community education project. And I would encourage everybody who's in education to do your day job in education, whatever that is. But then you have your non-day job, which is really thinking about the kind of education that girls and boys really need that might not actually be in the curriculum ever at this point, and figuring out strategies for how to do that. Very often churches get involved in this, but sometimes they're just a little too conservative for me, right, in terms of what they say about girls. Media is very interesting in terms of messages coming from media and the power of social media in particular to get images and ideas and analyses distributed and out to populations. So I think there's a lot of space here now that didn't used to be the case when the ideas were so tightly rationed by teachers and unsympathetic librarians and school principals who really didn't care. They were just really their own career. And by a lot of people who simply didn't think Black girls were worthy of time. Why would you be worried about Black girls? They're just Black girls. Those Black girls are the center of the community that is to come. They are the future. They are the mothers. They are the grandmothers. They are the ones who will take care of things when men are attacked, incarcerated. They are the ones. And the whole notion of not turning them into adult little strong women, telling them your life is going to be really rough, but protecting them and equipping them to critically think about the lives that they're going to lead would be my vision for Black girls. Now, I have 2 little grandsons. I don't even have any Black girls anymore. This is very sad for me, but that's okay. I can make a similar case for Black boys. But I think to make this case, we have to do that, whether we are encouraged to do it or not. Doesn't matter. These are our children.
Sim, tranquilo. Oi, gente, boa noite, boa noite. Licença para eu ficar de costas aqui para vocês, deselegante, mas vai ser necessário. Meu nome é Ana Raquel, eu estudei aqui nessa instituição, sou historiadora. Da hora demais você ter colocado a foto do Núcleo Negro ali. Eu estava aqui há 10 anos atrás. Oi, Olivia. Quando a Olivia ainda nem estava aqui, vi a Olivia na barriga da mãe dela. Quando a gente criou aquele núcleo de alunos negros. E é da hora ver que existe uma continuidade no trabalho, mesmo que nossos corpos, e nosso pensamento, e nossas ideias não estejam mais aqui. Da hora demais. Minha pergunta, quando você fala sobre pátria, confesso que, para mim, é algo que me gera inquietação. Porque a ideia de pátria que a gente tem aqui é uma ideia de algo que só é possível de existir se a gente não existir. Essa pátria que é a nossa morte. Não é possível, na minha visão, uma coexistência dentro dessa. E aí, a ideia de comunidades imagens. Quando a gente imaginou essa comunidade do Núcleo Negro, a gente não tinha dimensão do impacto que ela poderia causar. E eu acho que a gente tem exemplos aqui no Brasil de comunidades concretas, imaginadas e práticas na ação política, como os quilombos, por exemplo, que desde o século XVI são instituições paralelas, são outras comunidades dentro desse território. E aí eu queria te ouvir um pouco sobre, talvez, os tensionamentos que existam entre comunidade e pátria, porque me interessa, às vezes, olhar mais do ponto de vista do território, porque o território pode ser aqui o Pimentas, esse bairro, pode ser essa cidade, pode ser ali a minha vila, enfim. Os tensionamentos entre território, pátria e comunidade, como você vê isso? Entendendo que talvez essa pátria aqui seja nosso território inimigo. Obrigada.
Basically, all I'm saying is we live on a globe of sovereign nation states. And as long as that particular political structure is in place, that is the structure that grants people their rights. That is the structure that organizes race, that determines what race means in Brazil and what it doesn't mean in Brazil. That is the structure that we have inherited. Now, we can talk about decolonizing that all we want, but if that national sovereignty model stands intact, that automatically positions people within a nation state who do not accept that nation state in a position of peril. What I'm trying to say is you have as much right to claim the nation as anybody in it. And you can claim it through any series of devices that you want, through a homeland, through history, through a variety of things. It is not going to go away. The whole notion of avoiding it, that's a really good idea if people are seriously persecuting you. But the point is, what does that say to the future? What does that say for the people who are coming next? So I'm basically arguing for working with what we have now and trying to think about other ways of being than just this national framework. So I'm critical of this national framework for the reasons that I commented on authoritarianism. But that doesn't mean that there are no alternatives. We have to create the alternatives. And that, to me, is what you're talking about. Creating alternatives to what we have been given. And creating alternatives using the past, using the land. You were talking about strategies that could be very powerful in taking on the nation, which is just bigger than your community or my community or your family or my family. So last time I checked, I can't just ditch being American. That's where it all comes from. I have to fight that fight because that is the citizenship fight that I inherited. So I recognize that there are other traditions here. I recognize that the pain that's associated with that. But you belong here. You just don't belong to that nation the way it's been constructed. So rather than you change, you can change. I want it to change. So there is space for you.
Boa noite, boa tarde. Olá, eu sou a Esther, sou doutoranda na PUC São Paulo. Eu estudo sobre a mulher, o que é ser uma mulher coreana aqui em São Paulo, através da sua prática da alimentação. Como a prática da alimentação estrutura normas de como uma sociedade deve se organizar. Segundo a sua aula, acho que é melhor eu começar com uma fala das entrevistadas que eu entrevistei, que foi o seguinte. Quando eu entrevistei uma mulher coreana, que faz parte da instituição religiosa dentro da comunidade aqui em São Paulo, ela veio com uma frase, da seguinte frase: eu não vou separar do meu marido, ou eu não vou deixar de ser mãe dos meus filhos, ou manter essa estrutura, porque eu estou obedecendo, ou porque eu quero manter a tradição coreana, da estrutura familiar coreano-oriental, que vem muito do ideal confucionista. Mas é porque é a cruz porque eu recebo como se fosse uma cruz que eu preciso carregar. Então, Esses tipos de falas muito similares é muito presentes quando, no dia a dia, reflete no dia a dia das mulheres coreanas dentro da comunidade coreana. E fez eu lembrar desta frase quando você traz de que essa questão, esse questionamento, será que as comunidades, da forma que eles organizam, não está tendo essa forma hierárquica autoritária? Será que eles também não estão mantendo essa estrutura? E eu queria, na verdade, que você, se for possível, dê exemplos que você tenha observado desse sujeito mulher, que sim faz parte de uma instituição religiosa, mas, ao mesmo tempo, na prática, ela está querendo praticar uma igualdade. Então, acho que eu queria mais, se você observou esse paradoxo desse sujeito mulher durante seus estudos. Não sei se eu fui muito clara. So, I was actually formulating the questions in English first, because maybe it would be more clear and objective. So I'm going to do it if you guys... I just want, if in your studies, during your studies, if you have seen this paradox between this maybe Black woman that she say that she's Christian, but at the same time, and she's inside these communities, this paradox of this subject, yeah, well, I tried.
What stands out for me from what you've said, what came into my mind immediately were all the womanist theologians. There's a growing group of Black women in the United States who often do not want to call themselves feminists. That's fine, but they call themselves womanists. And what they're doing is they're fundamentally taking these religious traditions and disbelieving the way they've been interpreted in the past. They're reinterpreting everything. Scripture, they're the ones that get in there and they talk about all this stuff. So to me, what they're doing is claiming power within community settings in ways that allow them to have alliances with other people, but where their agendas are not reduced to the agendas of other people. They don't have to toe the line and say, I'm a Black man or whatever. They can basically say, we are going to look at issues that affect Black women, violence, reproductive issues, sexuality. They go right on down the line of all the stuff that you would hear in any feminist movement. But because they're putting Black women in the center, and because they're coming at it by challenging all those ideas, many of them about conservative communities, right? What they're doing is they're able to create space to do something different. So it's fascinating because I'll be honest with you, they scare me. These women are just powerful. So I believe, I can see the authority of alternative cultures, religion, all of that. It just often doesn't become identified as such. Now I'd have to think about the whole notion of the cross to bear, because that one is not something I've ever identified with. I'm just going to say. I mean, if somebody tried to put a cross on my back and said, bear it, I'd say that's not going to happen. All right, so we just need to have another chat at some point. But so the whole notion of all the ways in which women are empowering themselves, Black women in particular, and I truly believe that the scuffle that we have in the US around the evangelicals is a big evangelical tradition in the US globally. But in the US, early on in Donald Trump's campaign, you would hear the evangelicals are all for Trump. The evangelicals are all for Trump. And as his presidency proceeded, it was really clear that the Black evangelicals were saying, oh no, all right, that's not what we have in mind here, right? So the news began to cover that increasingly as the white evangelicals, which opened up space for many of the white evangelicals to actually leave their churches because these churches were asking them to carry that cross in a certain way. So nobody says you have to give up religion, but religion is all about interpretation. Who's interpreting? Who has the power and the authority to speak for the church? It's very similar to who has the power and the authority to speak for the family. or who has the power and authority to speak for the community? And I am just asking us to dig a little deeper in thinking about how these categories, this intersectional analysis, creates some space there to challenge that and to come up with alternatives, not just challenge it. Do it differently. Thank you.
Bom, eu gostaria então de agradecer muitíssimo a nossa querida Patrícia, a queridíssima Matilde e a todos vocês que estão aqui. E gostaria de lembrá-los que na terça-feira tem mais uma aula pública em que a gente vai poder ter o privilégio de ouvir mais uma vez Patrícia Hill Collins. Boa noite.